MCAS and histamine intolerance, I tend to look at them as one. And the reason being is because there are feedback loops that do join them together.
I like your categories. That's kind of a unique take. And this is where I think people struggle with the histamine is like there's so many things.
It's because it's related to energy metabolism. And this is where we get into why so many symptoms and why so many people have it.
You have a lot of great health info on your Substack, on your social media. And one post that caught my attention was your discussion about MCAS and histamine. So we talked and we're going to do an episode about that today because I think you look a few layers deeper. And a lot of people struggle with those things but don't get answers. And there's a lot of surface level approaches. So looking forward to digging in a little bit more and hopefully giving people a better understanding of what's going on. And most importantly, some steps they can start to take to hopefully feel better. But to start, can you just share it sounds like you have some people that reach out to you with this issue. So what do you hear from them? What drew your attention to it to say, hey, this is a bigger issue and we need to think about this a little differently?
Um, yeah, I think what kind of really drew my issue to this is that, well, I do notice that a lot of people struggle with this. And it is a big issue. And I've just not been satisfied with the information that I've been able to come across when it comes to MCAS and histamine myself. So I think that a lot of the information really focuses on like, these are some herbs that you can use and they're going to help you ease your histamine reactions. Or here you can take the DAO enzyme and that's going to help you break down histamine in foods. But there isn't really a lot of content that really goes into trying to understand like, okay, but why is this person dealing with this in the first place? Like, why is person A able to eat Parmesan cheese and salami and all that stuff and be under a lot of stress and they're totally fine? And then person B has to eat like a maximum of 5 foods and then they have reactions to everything and they're just not doing well. They're having all these symptoms. They're waking up in the middle of the night. They are having eczema and flushing and allergies. And yeah, there's just not been a lot of content that really looks into that. And I've seen this. So why I started investigating this is actually because I have received a lot of messages on Instagram having my followers ask me, like, do you have any information on MCAS? Do you have anything on histamine intolerance? I'm dealing with this. And that's what really got me to investigate this topic and try to address it from a way that actually gives people some answers as to like, why are you actually dealing with this and how to address it at the root of the issue, as opposed to just trying to get your symptoms to be less severe.
Yeah, amazing. Because I do feel that with this issue, a lot of people spin their wheels, or just feel stuck or have those questions like, I can only eat 5 things. Or another common question is, do I have this? Is this part of my issue? I know for me
Yeah.
that was a big one. It's like no one ever, doctor or health practitioner, no one ever diagnosed me, brought it up, but no one even really looked at it either. I don't think there was much awareness at that time. And so when I would look into it myself, read the symptoms, like, well, yeah, I got a lot of those, but some of them I don't have, and certain foods, I think I'm tolerating it okay. But on the other hand, I don't feel well. And a classic issue with chronic illness is people have trouble tying, directly X action or X food, Y food creates this symptom. So there's a lot of blurred lines and it's confusing. So maybe we could just start there. Sounds like there's people who become aware of this and are searching for their problem and reach out to you. But what are some telltale signs for anyone listening to this that they don't feel well, they haven't pinned it down? Maybe they have some histamine intolerance or some MCAS that they haven't nailed down yet.
Yeah, so I think I would also address this by saying that oftentimes MCAS and histamine intolerance are presented in a way like these conditions are very different, don't confuse the two, one with the other. But I tend to look at them as one. And the reason being is because there are feedback loops that do join them together. So I don't want to get too into nitty gritty, but I do want to kind of address this part. So, for example, let's say that somebody maybe starts out with histamine intolerance, which would be that they struggle with the histamine that's found in foods. They are not able to metabolize it fully, and that's causing them issues. Well, if they are not able to actually fully metabolize the histamine, histamine itself can actually act as a mast cell degranulator. it can signal for the degranulation of mast cells. So now and it can also signal for loosening the tight junctions of the gut. So it can make the gut leaky in and of itself. That can get certain compounds that shouldn't be outside of the gut, that can trigger mast cells to degranulate because they are our like first line responders to any sort of damage. So in that sense, you can start out with histamine intolerance, and that can trigger MCAS for you in a sense. So they can be connected. Even with something like MCAS, that itself, it's like if you already are in this inflammatory state where your mast cells are degranulating, they are releasing these inflammatory mediators like histamine, like in, certain other cytokines. That itself can also trigger for the opening of the gut lining. That can impair your ability to make DAO, which is the enzyme that breaks down histamine. So I just wanted to address that. There are a few more feedback loops, but the two can go together basically. And now, in terms of like noticing why or noticing if someone has it, I think that the histamine mediated issues or the histamine mediated symptoms are the easiest to notice. Because, well, with MCAS, again, you don't just release histamine. You also release the different interleukins when they degranulate. You release serotonin, prostaglandins. But the histamine issues are easy to notice, I would say, because they do fall into these like three categories. And I call them leakiness, expulsion, and excitation. So with leakiness, histamine can cause like flushing. It opens up the small capillaries so that you can get blood and immune cells to a place where there's some damage happening. So you can see like hives and flushing and those types of things. You can see low blood pressure because when blood is going into the capillaries and when you have fluid and edema gets into tissues, you can actually lose your blood volume that you have circulating. So then you can get dizzy, you can get vertigo. And then with leakiness, also the opening of the gut lining. So that can show up as a whole plethora of gut issues that are characterized by maybe bacteria or food components translocating to places where they shouldn't be. So you can have a lot of flatulence after meals. You can have a lot of bloating. You can have really rapid stools. And then with expulsion, so histamine, again, it helps us, or inadequate amounts, it should help us get rid of offenders in a sense, right? So it helps you expel things by sneezing. The typical allergic reaction, you're sneezing. So you can have a lot of sneezing, a lot of reactions that are kind of along that realm. You can also, again, have things like asthma is related to it. So again, the bronchi in your lungs will constrict to help you expel things. And again, you can also have digestion related expulsion. So vomiting, nausea is also related. Pregnancy nausea is histamine related. Motion sickness. Another one that's kind of inconspicuous and it's kind of in this, I guess, expulsion realm is that histamine also helps to release different digestive juices. So, stomach acid, saliva. If someone goes to the dentist and the dentist is always like, oh, wow, like you're making way too much saliva relative to like the normal person, that can be histamine mediated. Something like GERD. So, when you're overproducing stomach acid. And then excitation is an interesting one because that really means like kicking something off. So, histamine is involved in waking us up, for example. And if we wake up way too early, or if we wake up like just throughout the night, like the typical waking up at 3 in the morning, racing thoughts, because again, histamine is also involved in our nervous system and thinking and kicking off thoughts. So if someone's waking up in the middle of the night, racing thoughts, things like that, that can be very much histamine mediated. Um, and a lot of different symptoms really go into MCAS as well. Like, I think that the hives, waking up in the middle of the night, digestive stuff, they're big ones, but also different mood peculiarities can go into it. Like, I know that MCAS and histamine can be associated also with things like OCD, or even there's some links between things like bipolar disorder. just because histamine can also increase other neurotransmitters. It can increase serotonin, it can increase dopamine, adrenaline. So there's, yeah, anything really within that realm. So yeah, edema, sneezing, um, digestive disturbances, hives, eczema. Um, that kind of, I think, encapsulates a lot of the symptoms of it.
Yeah, I like your categories. That's kind of a unique take. And when you're laying them out, and this is where I think people struggle with the histamine is like there's so many things. And anyone
Yes.
listening to that who thinks they might have it or is struggling with it is probably a little bit just exhausted and just like, oh gosh, this
Mhm.
is hitting everything. Why is that? Why does it affect so much?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start off by saying that I'm not crazy about like diagnostic categories of like trying to pinpoint like you have histamine intolerance or you have MCAS. And I will say why. The reason being that I don't see it as being like an on-off switch, right? You can be somebody that can handle a certain amount of histamine containing foods on a certain day, but not on a different day. You can have stronger histamine reactions on one day than a different day. And the reason why I see it as like a spectrum that fluctuates, and it's because it's related to energy metabolism. And this is where we get into why so many symptoms and why so many people have it. So histamine is a molecule that the body uses to respond to damage, tissue damage, or patterns associated with damage. That's the way that I look at it. And our mast cells, they are all over the body, but they are mostly found in areas where our body interacts with the outside world, right? So, like the digestive tract, you have the digestive tract, you have food coming in from the outside. And that's, something that your body's interacting with that's not within the body's own environment. You have the lungs, right? So you're breathing in the air. You again have pollution particles or anything else coming in from the outside world, or your skin. So they are like our first responders, where whenever the body comes in contact with something that can damage it, or that does damage it, mast cells respond. And now, how does energy metabolism come into it, and what is that even? So this is something that I really talk about on my Substack, and something that I see as like the foundation really of what makes somebody healthy. And this is very much in line with Dr. Ray Peat's point of view, research, and it's about, well, fundamentally, when we eat food, right, that is not energy yet. Our cells have to actually convert that food into energy. And then that energy is used to maintain the structure of our cells, maintain all of the functions, to help them repair themselves, all of that. And when we struggle to make adequate energy because either we're not eating enough, or maybe we don't have enough thyroid hormone that controls the speed at which we can make energy, or maybe we don't have the right nutrients that actually help our cells turn food into energy. So big ones are like magnesium, the B vitamins, especially B1, copper. Then the body can struggle to actually make enough energy to maintain itself properly. And when the body struggles to make enough energy, it becomes a lot more prone to damage. Or, in other words, I would say that it takes a smaller stimuli to inflict damage, and there's also more damage happening in the body. So, for example, like reactive oxygen species, which are a byproduct of our cells making energy, they are more likely to accumulate when our cells are actually making energy too slowly, and they can degranulate mast cells. Also, when our cells struggle to make enough energy, it's easier for them to just get damaged by existing. And when that damage happens, not only do the molecules that, like the reactive oxygen species that are involved in the damage, not only can they degranulate mast cells, but also the damage itself can, um, yeah, like just you have damage that's happening, and our immune system does respond to that. So it doesn't just respond to like viruses or bacteria; it also responds to anything that gets damaged. Um, and I'm kind of getting to a nitty gritty, but I am really just kind of wanting to get into a lot of like how our hormones, our thyroid hormone, and how that dictates our mast cells reactivity, and why so many people are affected just because of the relationship with that.
Yeah, well, I think that's really important because when you look at all the symptoms you laid out and just the struggle people go through, histamine, MCAS, et cetera, it's like you could chase your tail forever running around trying to how to fix this symptom, how to fix that. It's just a no sum game. Like you
Yeah.
can't win it. People stress themselves out and feel like they're banging their head against the wall. So I think getting into why is it actually happening is really crucial because that's where you can have some success. So can we just start with you said mentioned a couple times the thyroid and not eating enough as far as low
Yeah.
energy in the body. Can we touch on those as to let's just start with not eating enough because that might be a little more simple, but I do want to circle back to thyroid. How is this causing a deficit of energy in the body that then leads to this downstream cascade, ending in all these uncomfortable symptoms?
Yeah, sure. So I think if we just focus on not eating enough, I feel like there's a couple of things there. So one, um, if you're providing your body less that than it needs, it's not going to be able to sustain itself on less forever, right? Like if it were to, let's say that you're only giving your body 1,500 calories as an example number, and currently your body's burning 2,000 as maintenance, right? Well, if you're gonna chronically give it 1,500, but you're always burning 2,000, that would just mean that eventually you waste away, right? So your body's gonna have to turn down its metabolism at some point to basically make sure that you don't waste away. And what does it mean to turn down the metabolism? Well, you're gonna be producing a lot less thyroid hormone, and all the processes in your body are gonna be happening slower. So again, your ability to repair, your ability to maintain yourself is going to be slowed. You're going to be more likely to incur damage. And that's one thing there. The other thing is if you're not eating enough, especially if you're not eating enough carbohydrates, your body has to maintain blood sugar. So in your blood, you always have glucose, you always have sugar, even if you eat zero glucose, zero carbohydrates, you're always going to have glucose in your blood. And that's because you have certain tissues like parts of the brain, your eyes, that simply just cannot run on fat entirely. So if that glucose is not coming from food, where is it coming from? Well, your liver has to actually make it for you. And now, how that becomes problematic is because the hormone that signals for the making of sugar in the body is called cortisol. That's our stress hormone. And for the adrenals to release cortisol, they have to get a signal from somewhere telling them, hey, we have to release cortisol. And that signal initially comes from a hormone called CRH, which comes from the brain. CRH degranulates mast cells. So if somebody is chronically under eating, if they are maybe fasting for long periods of time, or if they're doing like total carbohydrates avoidance, they're always going to be in this pseudo stressed state where their body has to activate the HPA axis to tell cortisol and tell the liver, hey, make some sugar to put in our blood. Because we know that if, let's say, blood sugar drops below, like I think it's 70, you can actually pass out because you can't get enough sugar to the brain to run the nervous system. And that itself, putting somebody in that chronic stress state can already start degranulating mast cells.
Fascinating. So let's go back to what's an appropriate amount to eat. Before the episode, we were also trading messages, and one thing I said was when I first learned about nutrition, I mean, I just ate the standard American diet for
Yeah.
30 years of my life. And then when I started having health issues and came across nutrition, in 2 months, it just changed my entire life. More energy, clearer thoughts,
Mhm.
more muscle building with less exercise and working out. It was just incredible. It was like, I felt like I took the limitless pill. So that changed my life forever and really, yeah, just really made an imprint on me with the power of nutrition. And one thing as I learned about it or looked into it or shamefully reflected on my past eating habits, one common thing that's I would say typically said about typical American food is we just overeat. We eat big plates, totally lacking
Mhm.
nutrients, but still like
Yeah.
too much. And so when I switched, as part of my switch to nutrition, I was like, yeah, I think that's true. I think I'm just shoveling food in. It's hyper palatable. It's made of chemicals to be addictive and delicious. So I cut back, but part of switching to whole food nutrition is that there are lower calories. I mean, you eat two cups of vegetables, two giant cups of vegetables, that could be only 100 calories, depending on what it's cooked in, if there's any sauce or oils or things like that.
Mhm.
So I always kind of had that struggle. I'm like, well, seems like Americans, and now it's, most Western countries have overeating, but at the same time, if you undereat, as you just laid out, you're going to run into some serious issues. So, how can people think about this to find the right balance for themselves, so they're not chronically underfeeding, but not
Mhm.
getting into bad habits that modern food has led us to?
Yeah, I think a few things there because I also see different patterns as well. Like, for example, with a lot of the women that reach out to me, I actually see the opposite, swing of the pendulum, where they come from a background of chronically dieting and under eating, and they've never actually eaten enough for their body ever in their lives. They might have all these symptoms, and I ask them, like, can you track maybe in something like Chronometer? Which is like an app that you use to track your food intake, and it also shows you how many of different nutrients you're getting. I might ask them like, okay, can you track how much you're eating? And it actually turns out that they're eating like a toddler amount. And that then just by getting them to slowly, slowly over time increase their calories, they see a lot of their symptoms disappear. But I think with the example that you're making about the standard American diet, I think that there are issues with that that go far, far beyond just portion size and calories. I think you have issues with, just the contamination of the foods, also with things that are just used as preservatives that are themselves damaging to the body, that can themselves also trigger mast cell degranulation. You have issues with the polyunsaturated fats, the seed oils, which I know are kind of a trendy topic right now, but they are a problem as well when it comes to mast cells, and I'd be happy to get into that later. And then you have the nutrient deficiencies, which are also huge because, well, you need different micronutrients like the B vitamins, magnesium, copper to make energy out of food, to make the enzymes that break down histamine, to get rid of excess estrogen that your body comes in contact with because that itself can degranulate mast cells. But I think that when it comes to actually getting somebody to eat the right amount, I think an easy way to start is there are those like calculators you can find online for I forget the I think it's the basal metabolic rate calculator where it does ask you to put in your current weight, your height, your activity level, and it tells you kind of like the ballpark estimate of calories that you should be eating. So I would say that oftentimes I see where somebody does it and they might actually say the opposite, which is that, oh my God, this number seems very high and I don't know how I could eat that. And at that point, I think it's important to actually work up to the point where they can eat that much. Um, and I would also say that ideally, I would like to see somebody eventually get to the point over time where they can eat more than the number that those calculators give them. And why I say that is because I think that the true kind of epidemic that we're suffering from right now is that not so much that people are eating maybe. So I also say I live in Europe, right? So maybe my perception is a bit skewed as well because I don't see those like massive portion sizes, right? Um, but I think that right now we more so suffer from like an epidemic where maybe we don't actually eat that much more than our ancestors did, but we're just a lot worse at actually being able to turn that food into energy. So instead, it just gets deposited on the body as fat. Like, I think that if we think of the stereotypical like overweight person, right? We don't think of them as having a ton of energy, right? Like they're not, running around and jumping and doing more than a fit person. Usually they're actually lethargic. They are not excited. And I think that that should kind of show us like, okay, clearly the food that this person's eating is not turning into energy. It's turning into fat. And we should be asking why that is.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. And I will add that I've seen people, like I had a client use one of those calculator and put in current weight and target weight. And the calculator
Hmm.
came back and she's like, I need to eat. Well, she came to me eating 1,200 calories or maybe
Yeah.
even like 800 because that's what the calculator said. And because it's just a math equation. So I will agree. And when I'm sure when people are the person listening to this, when they hear, oh my gosh, I should eat more calories than the calculator, like instantly people are going to be afraid about gaining weight because that's such a huge image and judgment aspect of our culture, so that will definitely feed into people eating on the low side. But I love what you just said because it's like, well, that is only one piece of the equation, and if say someone's energy efficient or can translate their food into energy rather than
Mhm.
storing it, then people can be less afraid of food. And why not start there? Say, okay, is my body an efficient converter of my food to energy? And if not, why not? And if that gets solved, then there's going to be less of the stress, anxiety, and worry about adding extra pounds from eating what could be adequate number of calories.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's about, increasing that number slowly and also focusing on the right foods, focusing on foods that have a lot of the micronutrients that our bodies need to actually be able to make energy out of food. And then instead of, you increasing calories and putting on fat, you can actually see that you increase calories and maybe things that weren't happening are now happening. Like maybe your hair is growing thicker, or maybe it takes you a lot more stressors to actually feel stressed. Like your body has more energy to do things.
Okay. Can we real quick give maybe some rough guide rails for what does slowly look like? Because that means different things to different people. And then I really am curious too about what about this person you mentioned at the beginning who only tolerates 5 foods, right? And that person probably is under eating, right? And if part of
Mhm.
their solution is to eat more, but they feel worse every time they eat, how do you guide people to start to wiggle their way out of that?
Yeah, so I think that now we're also getting into the remediation part, and I think that when I mean slowly, I mentioned chronometer already, and I'm gonna mention it again. I think that can be a very helpful tool, and what it is, it's kind of like a food tracker, but what's good about is that it also gives you a rough estimate of like how many of the different micronutrients you're getting. So your vitamins, your minerals, how much protein you're getting. I'll probably ask somebody to start tracking food with that and try to increase their intake by let's say like 50 calories a week, right? So going very slow and then also monitoring like, is their energy improving? Are their symptoms improving, or is everything staying the same? And then in terms of the foods to eat, so I think that with that, there are a few foods that I find to be quite functional when it also comes to MCAS energy, all of that. Um, and I think that's something like increasing, let's say, gelatin intake can be very helpful. And I would say not from things like bone broth, because of course you have issues with when you boil something for a very long time, you increase the glutamate levels in that. The glutamate itself can actually act on histaminergic neurons. So that can create some issues there. And then I guess with boiling bones, there are other issues there. Like, what are you extracting from the bones? Is it calcium or is it lead? But I mean, more like if you take a gelatinous piece of meat, something like oxtail or something even like uh, chicken feet, if somebody's more adventurous, or something like beef cheeks, boil that for 3 or 4 hours. That's going to be a lot less likely to actually cause a histamine reaction. And then you're going to have a broth that's going to have a lot of the amino acid glutamine in it. And glutamine is an amino acid that the cells that make up our gut lining can actually use to make energy out of. So, if your gut cells can make energy, they're a lot more likely to actually stay intact, and they are harder to inflict damage upon. What this translates to in human speak is that getting a lot of glutamine in can help you prevent getting leaky gut. That itself should be able to help you actually tolerate more foods, keeping the gut integrity so you can eat more things. Um, and then I would say that when it comes to actually, yeah, I think that this gets into a lot because I think with the question like how can somebody eat in a way that's not going to trigger their symptoms, it's going to be very person to person dependent based on what they're reacting to right now. I think that generally safe foods to start with for a lot of people tend to be like fresh meat, because histamine tends to actually accumulate in meat and in food in general from bacterial production. So if something's a little bit spoiled, I would say, or even if it's been sitting in the fridge for a couple of days, it might have a higher histamine content. But anything that's very fresh, so fresh meat, fresh milk, and I tend to go more for A2, and I can get into why that is in a bit. Fruit, even. maybe cooking some fruit to break down some of the fibers. That tends to be quite easy on the digestive tract, and that tends to be something that many people might be able to increase slowly. And usually as as your metabolic rate increases, that tends to help people tolerate more foods, partially because one of the markers of a good metabolic rate is that you are able to have more bowel movements, ideally multiple per day. That helps to kind of keep the digestive tract more clean. You have less bacterial proliferation, and the bacteria is what can actually damage the gut. So, slowly, that should help somebody tolerate more foods over time.
Okay. So say someone starts to make some progress in the food they're eating, just in terms of getting enough calories. What else are the key pieces of this low energy state
Mhm.
and working out of that?
Yeah, so I think with that, I kind of want to also go into, yeah, thyroid, estrogen, and nutrients, because I think that's such a big part of, what causes mast cell degranulation, what causes histamine reactions. And so I'll start with that. So I think with the, thyroid hormone piece, um, so, to kind of explain its importance, it's a hormone that controls the rate at which our cells make energy. And I would say that as a general population, we tend to have this problem right now where our thyroid rate is generally low. And we can see that because our body temperatures are dropping. A very few people right now have a body temperature of 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius. um, and the importance of thyroid hormone is partially that it actually helps to reduce the number of mast cells that we have and makes them less reactive. So that's something that we've seen in studies. And another aspect of it is that it actually helps us keep our estrogen levels lower. So it controls the rate at which our liver can detox old estrogens. And when our thyroid function is low, our digestion tends to slow down, our liver function tends to slow down, and we do get exposed to a lot more estrogens right now just from the way that we live, right? So we get exposed to plastics, fragrances, things like that, and that tends to compound together with the estrogens that we make in the body. And estrogen, what it does is it's an excitatory hormone. So it makes cells take up calcium. And when mast cells take up calcium, they degranulate. So in a low thyroid state, we tend to become more estrogen dominant. And with that, we tend to actually have more reactions. And that's also a big piece of what's contributing to a lot of these mast cell disorders right now, is that we are in this low thyroid, high estrogen state. Um, and then how micronutrients do contribute to that is that, well, when we're eating foods that don't have enough of certain micronutrients, like let's say selenium or iodine or retinol that we need to make thyroid hormones, we can't make them. If we don't get the micronutrients that we need to detoxify estrogen, like B vitamins or zinc or magnesium, we can't really get rid of it well enough. We can't support our liver. Um, and we can't also get enough of the micronutrients that we need to run the enzymes that help us detoxify histamine.
So would you say those are the big 3? Because you're right, low thyroid is just,
Mhm.
I mean, it's so common. So many people have it. So frustrating, depending on the symptoms, if you got sluggish bowel movements or if you're just cold all the time or more
Mhm.
tired, sluggish, lethargic, low mood, like just really rough symptoms, makes it tough to enjoy life and really,
Yeah.
live and feel like you're yourself. So someone's looking at that, are those the main things? They need to get enough food to have the potential for enough energy, get the right micronutrients so the body can create energy, and then as a byproduct of that, if there is enough energy, it can detox estrogen and these other toxins we're exposed to.
Yeah, I think that those are really the main things is, just being able to slowly get to a point where you eat more foods and getting in more of those micronutrient rich foods that your body actually needs to make hormones, detox toxins, make enzymes. But I think that some other things also add up, which is like what other things are we maybe eating or not eating that also contribute to these issues. And I think that, again, I kind of mentioned this in passing, a little bit, but there is this movement nowadays that is kind of warning about seed oils or polyunsaturated fats. Um, some people maybe don't really know like why these are an issue, but they do pose issues in the body. So there's some research showing that they can interfere with the transport of thyroid hormone to cells. So if you can't get your thyroid hormone into cells, you can't make energy. There's some research showing that the polyunsaturated fats actually interfere with the glucuronidation of estrogen by the liver, so with the ability of the liver to actually get rid of estrogens. And they actually do tend to be involved directly in histamine issues because a specific form of an omega 6 fat, which is found in seed oils, this one is also found in animal fat of animals that are fed seed oils, such as, the typical supermarket chicken or pork that's really fatty, that was maybe raised on corn or soy. And this fatty acid is called arachidonic acid. um, this fat works as like a building block for these inflammatory compounds in the body called prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And if somebody has a histamine or MCAS issue, they might actually be taking a drug that is a leukotriene blocker to relieve their problem. And well, the leukotrienes are made from this fat, and the prostaglandins themselves can actually degranulate mast cells, and then histamine can actually increase the conversion of arachidonic acid into prostaglandins, so it becomes a bit of a feedback loop. I think that that's another big aspect of, what's contributing to the issue, which again, I look at it systemically, which is like if you are having a low metabolism issue, you're going to be a lot more likely to have a high estrogen issue. You're going to be a lot more likely to have an MCAS issue. And that's going to kind of contribute to all of those across the board. And I think that the higher intake of polyunsaturated fats, the lower intake of micronutrients, general, I would say, under eating, or on the other hand, for a lot of people, high calorie malnutrition, as well as the exposure to environmental estrogens are really the big pieces that are kind of contributing to just the general health mess that we're seeing nowadays. And I think that MCAS is a big part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so as you're laying these things out, I think there's a lot of people today that, especially if they've been struggling with their health, they feel like I've been eating well, eating enough. Maybe, that's something they need to take a look at. Others have, right? So let's say they're like, I feel like I'm eating healthy. I've changed so
Yeah.
much. I think I'm eating enough. And I think everyone feels like they have some awareness of the toxins. Now, again, there's different layers to that because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
every year, honestly, it changes for me. I learned some new area and I'm like, oh, wow, I thought I had this buttoned up, my
Mm-hmm.
exposure limited. And, there's another step to take and it's a bit overwhelming. So people kind of need to step their way into that. So where do you see people having misconceptions, maybe thinking they're addressing it, but not, or maybe when you work with them, what are things that get uncovered that we're like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this helped solve it, especially for people who already feel they're a little more health focused and have made a lot of effort to address these things.
Yeah, totally. I think that right now we have a lot of different diet camps, and a lot of them tend to get some things right and other things not. And I think that there are very few places where you actually kind of get like all of the good information, I would say. So if let's say somebody is trying to be healthy and they're going to go down like the carnivore diet route, right? Like there are some positives with that, which one of them would be that you are very much most likely going to eliminate a lot of the fibers that you might be reacting to. So, kind of to backtrack a little bit, if somebody again has a metabolic issue, they are most likely going to be having fewer bowel movements. That's going to create an environment where they can have some sort of an overgrowth in their gut. In their large intestine, they might have a dysbiotic microbiome. It might overgrow to their small intestine. So now, every time they eat something that contains some sort of a fiber, the bad bacteria, if we want to call them that, might be fermenting it. The bacterial end products might be injuring the gut. Now you are degranulating the mast cells in your gut. You're having an issue, right? So, a lot of people who come from kind of the background of already having a gut problem might find a lot of relief reducing certain plant fibers, which I'm a fan of in certain contexts, but I don't want to get too detailed in that right now. So, yeah, you might be eating more meat. You're getting more of the animal product based nutrients, which tend to be more bioavailable. Certain B vitamins are a lot more bioavailable from meat products. You are getting the proteins from meat like cysteine and glycine and others that you need to make glutathione, that you need to actually help your liver detoxify. So that's good. On the other hand, you, especially if somebody's doing the whole meat only thing, well, on the one hand, they're not getting any of dietary carbohydrates in. So they are going to constantly activate the stress system to make their own carbohydrates. That's going to affect how their mast cells degranulate because stress is a big factor for mast cell degranulation. And another aspect is that they're probably actually going to be still lacking some very important nutrients. So they're going to be getting very little calcium in. And calcium is actually really important when it comes to preventing mast cell reactions. Reason being because when we are very low on certain minerals, let's say, I think the big ones are calcium and magnesium, which are very hard to come by from a meat only diet. We're gonna be activating our parathyroid hormone system. And what that system does is that it helps us pull minerals out of bone to basically provide them for the nervous system and other functions. Now, the problem is that parathyroid hormone itself degranulates mast cells because it is part of the stress system. And in certain countries, actually, calcium tablets are known to be something used to stop allergic reactions, probably because of that anti-parathyroid hormone function. So, yeah, you might be getting too little of that. On the other hand, you might have something like the paleo diet, right? Which I think a lot of people, especially like a few years ago, I think a lot of people really followed that coming from, like, let's say the standard American diet. It sounds pretty good, right? Like you're just eating things as raw as possible and everything, basically straight from the earth, right? But you still have certain things that kind of go wrong with that. I think that again, it's very much against dairy. So again, you're having this issue with you're not really getting calcium. Um, you also have a lot of these foods, I would say, when you eat certain plant foods raw. I think the one thing that comes to my mind right now is like, eating paleo and you're being told to eat like a lot of spinach, a lot of raw kale. Like, I'm not against plant foods, but I think that when it comes to certain things like kale or broccoli or even cauliflower, they have to be cooked very well, which is something that a lot of, healthy diets don't really emphasize, that certain plant foods actually have to be really, really thoroughly cooked to make sure that we can get nutrients out of them without them harming us. So something like kale tends to have goitrogenic compounds in them, which interferes with iodine uptake. So if you can't take up iodine, you can't make thyroid hormones. If you cook it very well, that goes away. Something like spinach tends to be extremely high in oxalates, which can act as mast cell degranulators. If you consume it together with a calcium source, like a traditional recipe where maybe you have like a cheese dip with spinach, that calcium actually prevents the absorption of oxalate. But now, if you're doing your healthy diet when you're drinking a spinach smoothie, now you're not getting this protection there. So, I think that, yeah, some common things that I see, I would say, with people that think they're doing a lot of things well, it really depends on what school of thought somebody is coming from. But if somebody is coming from a very plant-based school of thought, they might be missing out on a lot of the important nutrients, like the animal proteins that you need for liver function, like certain B vitamins, like B12, that are only found in animal products. If you're having someone coming from carnivore, they might still actually be missing out on a lot of the minerals, like manganese, which you need to make DAO, which when it comes to animal foods, it's found in like mussels, but you don't really get it in like steak if you're just eating steak. So again, depending where you're coming from, you might be missing out on different nutrients and you might be missing out on different macronutrients, such as, you're only emphasizing plant fats and you're just getting a lot of these seed oils in their whole forms, or you're only emphasizing proteins and you're not getting carbohydrates to actually keep the stress system down, or you are eating a diet that's very low in calcium, which itself is going to be stressful. So I think it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think that when it comes to, yeah, doing like somebody think that they're doing all the right things, it really depends what school of thought they're coming from. And I think that there are very few schools of thought right now nutritionally that kind of just emphasize like, hey, we probably need to eat every single food group. We just need to prepare these foods how they're traditionally meant to be prepared. So if something has always been soaked and sprouted and cooked thoroughly, it's probably for a reason. It's not going to be better for us if we just eat it raw. At the same time, if we've eaten a certain food group, be it protein or fat or animals or carbohydrates, um, if we've eaten this for thousands of years and we're just seeing issues in the last 30 years, that's probably not the problem. We have to figure out what the problem is.
One other one I find that's is dairy that can be maybe not demonized, but people will take out. It's definitely a little more, people react to it a bit more. I mean, dairy, gluten are kind of the classic first two that people sometimes remove and feel they're doing a lot better. But also, what I've learned is that sometimes that can be short term, and especially when you're laying out what calcium can do and how that runs all the way up the chain. For people who do react to dairy or at one time did and just cut it out, do you find one, like milk or cheese or something within dairy that's in general better tolerated, like might be a good place to start? Someone wants to start adding it back in and building it up in their diet.
Yeah, so I think a few things with that. One is our gut lining, which produces the enzymes that help to break down lactose in milk, so lactase, they adapt to what we're eating. So if somebody cuts out dairy for a very long time, their gut lining is going to stop making lactase because, well, why waste energy doing something that you're not using, right? So if then they try to reintroduce dairy very rapidly, they're most likely going to have a reaction because they don't actually have enough of the enzymes needed to break it down. So I would say that a very slow reintroduction is very important if somebody hasn't had it in years, like, starting with maybe a teaspoon of milk and then working up to a second teaspoon a week after or something like that. And then in terms of the actual specific dairy products, I think I kind of alluded to this a bit earlier, but I'm a big fan of actually A2 dairy. So something like goat milk, which I actually do find is more tolerated, especially if somebody is dealing with MCAS. Reason being is because opioids are one of those things that actually can contribute to mast cell degranulation. And A1 dairy is an opioid agonist. So a lot of cow milk, just because of the way that the cows have been bred, that the breeds have kind of artificially evolved to make them yield more milk, that has caused a mutation in certain dairy cows where they produce now A1 casein as opposed to A2 casein. So there are two types of milk proteins. And a lot of people can be quite, I would say, sensitive to A1 casein, especially if they're already coming from a background of maybe struggling with foods, to where that might contribute to mast cell issues. So I'm a bigger fan of dairy that has A2 casein, so like goat milk, sheep milk, where that might actually be easier for somebody to reintroduce and have less of a reaction. I would say that long term, the way that I see it is that long term, a person should be able to tolerate as many foods as possible. So right now, I drink any dairy and it works for me. But somebody that might be in a very compromised state might actually do better if if they start with A2 type dairy and then work up very slowly.
Yeah, makes sense. So earlier you had said, okay, if we're eating these more natural foods, we've been eating this way for 1,000 years. So if maybe we need to look at something else rather than demonizing some of those foods. So if we step outside of the diet, what would examples of that be? And maybe we can use this as a chance to give the person listening one, two, couple points of just practical takeaways they can go try or implement as a takeaway from this discussion.
Yeah, I think outside of food, especially if we try to kind of stick to this MCAS topic, although that, this applies to everything, I think that two big things that have really changed for us are one is just the exposure that we have right now to various environmental pollutants. So, be it things like perfumes or plastics or any sort of personal care products or cleaning products that might contain certain estrogenic compounds or even compounds that interfere with thyroid hormone binding. I think that now we are exposed to a lot more of that, and that also puts an extra burden on the body because the different micronutrients that we would normally use to make energy out of food or to run enzymes or to run the different organs, they are also used to detoxify these environmental pollutants, right? So we end up actually having to get a larger load of certain micronutrients to deal with that. I think that's one big one. And I think another big one is just being under chronic stress. So I remember seeing in one mice study where I think placing them under chronic stress for 3 weeks actually increased the number of mast cells in their brain and made them have sleeping issues and things like that. And I think that when it comes to, I guess, what has changed for a lot of us, I would say that chronic stress probably, just in different ways. I think that there's the biochemical stress, of course, of not having enough micronutrients, of under eating, of being exposed to polyunsaturated fats. There's also the chronic stress, I would say, of being exposed to maybe way too much information and always psyching ourselves out over something. And maybe you're not, I guess, the typical, stressor of you're not getting chased away by a lion or something, but you're probably always concerned with your job or finances or whatever. I don't know. I just think that as life has gotten more complex, so has our stress gotten more complex and probably more chronic. Magnesium is lost very quickly under stress. It's also lost very quickly when somebody's hypothyroid and its retention is impaired. And I think, again, getting more into it, like even something like zinc, it tends to be depleted very quickly when somebody has MCAS, because immune cells are constantly released in high numbers, and for their maturation, they do need zinc. Gut cells are always recycling, and any cell that's rapidly recycling needs zinc because it's needed for cell growth. I think some other things that I would also pay attention to is if somebody is dealing with estrogen dominance, because that is a very big contributor to MCAS. That is why more women have MCAS. That is why MCAS tends to get worse during times of the cycle when estrogen is higher, like ovulation or luteal phase for some women. So if somebody is dealing with that, I will try to very much pay attention to what exposure do you have to environmental estrogens. Can you decrease your toxic load by maybe switching to beauty products that don't have any scents or any perfumes, because a lot of perfumes tend to be quite estrogenic.
Okay. Yeah. Good tips. If people want to follow more of your work or work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so most of my work happens on Substack at fundamental.nourishment.substack.com. We over a lot of topics, but that's where I write a lot more about what I talked about here. I go into details on energy metabolism and different disease states, if you will. So I have an article there on how to actually address healing your gut. I have an article on there goes step by step through addressing MCAS. So that is the main place to find me. And then to, I guess, yeah, to keep up with what I post and when I post on Substack, I also announce about that on my Instagram page, which is just Fundamental.Nourishment on Instagram.
Okay, great. Yeah, fantastic resources. I highly recommend. So we'll link to those in the show notes if you're listening. Just scroll down and click. Kaya, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.